I'm Hakim Elnazarov, chairing this session. The first presenter is Isabelle Linais, doctor from Sciences for Center for History from France. And the topic of her presentation is Back in the New Land, a return of the peasant refugees to Samarkand, eastern Bukhara, in the mid of 1920s. Please welcome Isabelle online.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I deeply apologize for the quality of the internet and the landscape. I'm in the field. Thank you for your invitation. I think that yesterday's sessions showed how much the historical perspective matters and can be interesting to understand the issue of migration, especially the one concerning the 19th century. So I'm currently a PhD student, so it's just a work in progress now. And I'm studying the immigration and return from the Bukharan Emirates to Afghanistan and from Afghanistan to the Soviet Bukhara or Soviet Tajikistan and Uzbekistan from the end of the 19th century to the 1930s. So today I'm speaking about the return of peasant refugees to Soviet Eastern Bukhara. So first of all, why I'm speaking about the return? If you consider most of the studies about immigration, the perspective of return is maybe studied from an anthropological point of view or cultural one, but the sheer fact of returning is less studied. And usually the long-term distance and long-term and long-distance immigration is considered. But here I consider short-term immigration, several years, and the return of the refugees of Bukharan Emirate who fled this place, starting from the year 1920 with the so-called the downfall of the Bukharan Emirate, and who fled to Afghanistan. So here, what is interesting is to understand how the society, the Soviet society that became Soviet, welcomed those immigrants that were not only political immigrants, for example, the members of the Bukharan elite, the Amaldaron, the functionaries, the bureaucrats of the Bukharan Emirate, but were also soldiers, basmachi, as Soviets used to call them, the counter-revolutionaries, but also peasants, most of them. So who were, first of all, those refugees? So for you to understand, again, I speak about the people who fled the Bukharan Emirate that became Soviet for several reasons: disease, for example, crop failure, civil war, political crisis, and the fear of the Soviet regime. So the Tajik historians Rakib Abulhayev and Kamaluddin Abdulhayev are speaking of about 44 families that fled the nowadays Tajikistan to, most of them, Afghanistan. It's about maybe 200,000 immigrants. Another documents in the archives, in the National Archives of Uzbekistan, speaks of maximum 40,000 families, which is more or less 160,000 immigrants by the end of 1928. Kamaluddin Abdullayev and Rakib Abulhayev are speaking of maybe a third of all the households of nowadays Tajikistan who fled to Afghanistan in the 1920s. So the third key word here is not only return refugees, but also peasant. Why I'm speaking about peasants? I was inspired by the reading of James Pickett, who is an historian of the 19th century, Central Asia, for all the who says that most of the forced resettlements of peasants and other non-elite groups merits further studies, especially concerning the 19th centuries, because most of the sources about immigration from Central Asia in the 19th century concern elite migration. For example, from Kabul to Samarkand, or from Samarkand to Kabul. And here, what is interesting with those Soviet sources is because of the Soviet local interest for production, for example, and for attracting back those refugees, new sources were produced about peasant migration, which make the archives of the Soviet Bukhara and Soviet Tajikistan a very much interesting place to study the peasant migration on the border of Afghanistan. So briefly, I introduced to you the issue of refugees, and now I will speak to you about the return. How those returnees were welcomed, why they returned, why they decided to flee Afghanistan and to come back to the Soviet Bukhara, and how they were welcomed. So here I produced a graph that shows that, for example, for the year 1925, most of the returnees who were fleeing Afghanistan were coming back to Kulyab or Kurgantube, which is provinces, it's called Vilayat provinces of southern Tajikistan. And they are located here on the map. You can see them. Kurgantuba, Tepa, Kulyab, Gharm, which is the southern provinces of Afghanistan, of nowadays Tajikistan, bordering Afghanistan. So we see that those returnees are returning back to their homes in the southern vilayats of nowadays Tajikistan. But why? Maybe those refugees are returning to Kulyab, but maybe they are from Khujan or Samarkand and other northern regions. The statistics show that many of the returning families return in the year 1925, 1926. Why? The causes are different. One of the causes can be the defeat of Ibrahim Bek, which was a leader of the counter-revolution in the region in 1925. So maybe the end of the civil war in the region, which was not very the fact, but maybe that the atmosphere became more peaceful. Okay, so people were returning, but we have also to consider that the Soviet bureaucrats, local bureaucrats, were very annoyed by the emptying of the lands, of the borderlands. Here we have the testimony of Nasratullah Mahsum, who was in 1924 a member of the Central Executive Committee of the Bukharan People's Republic, created in October 1920, succeeding to the Bukharan Emirate. And in the end of the year 1924, he was the president of the Tajik Autonomous Republic, REFCA. What he says? He says, for example, in 1924, in Yaban, which is a place in South Dushanbe, where a lot of Uzbeks, Lokais, and supporters of Ibrahim Bek used to live, he testifies about a considerable void, emptying sown areas, a number of cattle or livestock also emptying, because of immigration to Afghanistan of the richest ones, but also the poorest ones. He testifies about poverty. People don't have a samovar. Most of them have only 2 wood cups, and the average, maybe 80% of them have scabies. Another testimony is at the border, speaks about Sarai Kamar, which is a place located also at the border with Afghanistan. For example, the testimony of the year 1924 speaks about, before the revolution, 28 inhabited krishlaks, which is villages, and after the revolution, for year 25, only 9 inhabited krishlaks, which tells a lot about the demographic emptiness of this place. So for year 1924, people start to come back. Year 29, there have been recorded maybe an average 2,000 families coming back to Kurgantuba, and also maybe 2,000 families coming back to Kulyab, which is here on the map. which makes, by the end of the year 1928, maybe 23,000 returnees of people, I mean, which is not much compared to the maybe 100,000 emigrants, but it is still consequent. We can wonder why those people decided to flee, because it is usually said that people used to fear the Soviet regime, atheism, but back to them, it was not till the beginning of collectivization. Collectivization began in 1929. So how the Soviet sources understand the return of those emigrants, of especially the peasant emigrant? So we have several sources. For example, you have a source of about year 1923, of course, concerning Turkmens, which were located more in the western part of this map, in today's Uzbekistan, but this testimony can be used, maybe. So about the Turkmens of the bordering vilayat of Kirki and Charju. So this is a testimony about the situation of immigrants in Afghanistan. Some make their living from working the land in Afghanistan and raising livestock, but the majority draw on their reserves and have not been able to establish themselves economically. Some refuse to pay taxes to the Afghan government. And also, this is an argument that is always present in local Soviet sources of the REFCOM of Tajikistan, for example, that the local Afghan government is preventing the legal return of the immigrants and their families, along with their livestock, cattle, maybe millions of cattle, and possessions, while the Afghan border guards have more than once fired on them, treated the immigrants savagely, and confiscated property. This is at least what the Soviet sources tell. Another source for year 1926, which is the local gathering of the Soviet of Kurgan-Kutuba, again border vilayat, speaks about the violence committed against immigrants in northern Afghanistan. Returnees are retained by Afghan soldiers at the border. The Afghan soldiers are ripping them off to the bone. Some cases of rape of women have been reported. This is at least the testimonies in the sources of local Soviet government. So quickly, what are the measures that are made to welcome those refugees who are returning back to a new Sovietized land? You have to know that in year 1925, a commission for the help of the refugees, for them to help to return to the Dushanbe, to Tajikistan, was created by the REFCOM of Dushanbe. And this commission was issuing returning forms. This is one of the returning forms. Unfortunately, I've just found 2 of them. So it is said somewhere that 10,000 of them were issued. I don't know how much. But here is a very interesting glimpse on the situation of 2 peasants. The name of their name is Jawad Assam Babajon and Muhammad Riaz Kurban. They are loci Uzbeks who fled Yovon, maybe with Ibrahim Bek, and they are coming back in year 1926. They are from the Kent Yaban. And they testify to have some possessions, 3 tanabs, which is not much. It is the average possession of a peasant in the region, according to sources of the end of the 19th century, 4 horses. And they have a barot, they have a certification to testify about their possession. And the reasons to leave Afghanistan, they say high tax burden, Salo, on the side of Afghanistan. And they also have local villages, people that can testify who they are, fakirlar. So other people from the same village where they are from that can testify that yes, they know these people, they can return to their land. Of course, so those forms were issued in Russian and here also in Tajik. In another document, it is said that they were issued also in Uzbek, but they are filled here in Uzbek. And there are about 20 types of questions. Of course, most of them are not answers. There is just answered yok, no answer, of course. So what was the purpose of those forms? In the archives, it is said that those forms are needed for the returnees to have credits and tax relief on the behalf of the Soviet local Tajik government. But another hypothesis is the securing of property rights. Why? Because as people fled, neighbors started to take their lands or their possessions or their houses. Though they were modest people, peasants. For example, here we have a testimony of the year 1928, which shows that maybe the commissions did not work that much well. For example, we have a testimony that the residents of the Kishlak Yar Kurgan, it's a village, Mullah Patshakul and Mullah Ishan Khatib, are forcing peasants to destroy the construction and houses of peasants who have fled to Afghanistan at the time. Those mullahs are using for their own purpose what the raw material of the destroyed house. And there is another case of Kara Aksakal, a chief from the Kishlak of Cherik, same Tuman, same region. And the Jerkans, the peasants themselves, especially the peasants who returned from Afghanistan, fulminate against such bad deeds. They have addressed complaints to the Jam Soviet of Cherik, it's the local Soviet government. And however, the accused has not been sanctioned. And here, for the local Tajik government, it is a problem also of legitimacy and reputation about securing property rights of modest peasants, immigrants. Here, this is what the remark of the police. Also, in the circles of returnees from exile has emerged the idea that the Soviet power wants to put an end to the returns to Tajikistan by not defending their. To conclude, I've explained you briefly the reasons to leave the Bukhara People's Republic: crop failure, disease, political crisis, civil war, fear of Soviet new regime, of course. What is here interesting, not only elite fled, but also modest people, peasants, to northern Afghanistan. The consequence is the sudden emptying of border vilayats, border region, which is really huge, about maybe a third of all the households of all nowadays Tajikistan. The reasons to leave Afghanistan and to come back to the Bukharan Soviet territory is maybe tax burden, violence, maybe according to Soviet sources again. And the places of return are the home place of the people who fled, because most of the people who fled to Afghanistan were people from the bordering regions. And to conclude, this document, the Soviet documents, tells us much about the Soviet local policy, temporary tax alleviation, and maybe temporary securing property rights of the returnees before collectivization. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for this very interesting and really fascinating topic, given especially that you did a quite in-depth research on looking at the return of the people who left the territories of Tajikistan upon arrival of the Red Army. Now we are moving to our final speaker of this panel. We have a young Minjia. She's a PhD student from Moscow State University. She's originally from China, but it's very interesting, fascinating that she learned Russian, she learned Tajik, and she did research on the Tajik migrants in Russia.
Thank you for Dr. Elnazarov for your introduction. This report will explore how the Tajik points laboring in the Russian Federation view humanities and knowledge as factors of both individual self-realization and an overall development of society. It draws attention to the disproportionate social status of contemporary inheritors of the Persian and poetic tradition in comparison with their specialties. The tragic experience reflected in their works exposes an unsurfable yet significant reality in Tajik communities, namely a skeptical attitude towards education and its results. This talk will contain 3 parts and a conclusion. The first part depicts such a contrast where Tajiks are normally traditionally the respected scholars who were normally associated with the wise. At present, young Tajiks are forced to labor abroad before finishing their education, and among the elder Tajik points who completed their tertiary education, a majority are working in the fields that do not match their specialties. On the first side, the prestige of knowledge is problematic among the Tajiks. Therefore, the second part investigates the biography and works of Nusrat Babayev and Bulimullah Gulov, 2 Tajik points who touch upon the issue of erudition. The third part compares these 2 representatives with other Tajik points living in the Russian Federation and affirms some characteristics they share in the context of cultural collisions. Analysis of representative episodes of their works and their lives unfolds the conditional nature of their skepticism towards knowledge. Hypothetically, a precise understanding of these conditions will facilitate the Tajik points living in the Russian Federation adequately realize their creative potentials. Thank you. Then, I bet each student of Persian language and literature have heard about the verses of Yudaki, father of New Persian poetry, دانش اندر دل چراغ روشن است و همه بر تن تو جوشن است. And the verses of Ferdowsi, the most preeminent composer of the epic Shahnameh, Book of Kings or Book of Ancient Iranian Kings. توانا بود حلقه دانا بود ز دانش دل پیروزنا بود. The value of wisdom and knowledge is attested in the name of the highest god of Zoroastrianism, Master, which means the Lord of Wisdom. But to talk about any issues related to Tajikistan, one inevitably takes into account that about a third, in most cases, a half of its annual GDP is made up of personal remittance. More could be learned from the approach of Said, leader of the section of social policy at the Center of Strategic Study, judges the migration trend. The so-called migrant workers bring about considerable income into Tajikistan. Moreover, the exploitation of workforce is a solution to unemployment in the country. It could be expected that the Tajiks working abroad as pillars for their folks could have some influence on their family members' worldview. Another point that could be deduced from the view of Philip Said is that the stimulation for the migration trend will be everlasting, since the country does not offer enough job vacancy. Halima Khushkhadamova, Tajik sociologist, she pays attention she also pays attention to unemployment, in particular among the young people. When she explains the reason for migration, she also suggests to her students to consider that Tajikistan has a larger proportion of young people. The country, in fact, has the highest fertility rate in the 5 Central Asian countries, according to international ratings conducted by whichever organization. To put in another way, domestic unemployment will probably continue, if not deteriorate, in the next 2 decades. And the migrants, in the milieu of Tajik migrant workers, the points comprise an extraordinary group. Halima Khushkhadamova, according to her conversation with migrant workers in 2008-2009, as well as discoveries of other experts, divides the Tajik migrant workers into 2 waves. The first one came to Russia in 1990s, and among them were most of her informants, and these informants of her work within their specialties. But the second view, the young Tajiks might have been deprived of the chance to receive professional education or gain language skills. But the situation for the migrant points are closer to the second view. While graduates in technical disciplines and medicine found their jobs as mechanicians or medical workers, graduates of humanities majors often found their qualifications unprofitable or unmarketable everywhere. Next slide, please. Yes. Nevertheless, the Tajik stylists or rhythmists, if call them in a humble way, as some of them wish, do create a great amount of emotional poetry. Their composition is spontaneous and voluntary. In comparison with professional points, migrant points are hardly accommodated or materially stimulated thanks to their poetic talents. In this sense, writing in limited leisure time and for sheer personal amusement just indicates genuine predisposition towards literature. Yes, I agree. There are two Tajik points who directly touch upon the issue of erudition, and Babayev displays more details of his point of view. He was born in 1976. He graduated from the Faculty of Tajik Philology in Babajang Kafulov Khujand State University, and Khujand is a city that's sited at the entrance of the Fergana Basin. It could be traced that he has been working as a cook or retailing vegetables at least since 2013 in the Ural Economic Region. Babayev has his personal site in Tajik. He has published an anthology, Lalai Vatan, the tulip on the ridge of the motherland. The word for Vatan, for motherland on the cover of his anthology is written in larger size, similar to the observation made by ethnologist Tahir Kalandalov that migrant points always write its first letter in uppercase. Babayev also confides that the environment where he works, the city, the people, their pets, are unfriendly and even hostile. This lyric presented in translation and original demonstrates how Babayev views erudition and erudite people. It contains 6 couplets, and the word for knowledge comes in the 3rd couplet. Technically, Halim, the verbal root is Arabic, and its gerund in conveys multiple meanings: knowledge, sciences, religious science, etc. Its active participle, Halim, reminds of scholars who investigate in theological and exegetic issues. But here, judging from the text, some scholars who besmirched the name of academy have deterred Babayev from the field. Other keywords also, to some extent, are linked with research and education. The word Doyang may designate young generations, and the phrase homeland could be interpreted as shrewdness, of which some intellectuals are criticized. The 4th couplet continues Babayev's view on the academic association. He denounces injustice and compares it with the wrestling from the back. It could be inferred that some deceiving contest, pretending to be academic, shattered the illusion of the author and reduced him to succumb to the need of maintenance, literally, the question of living. If disappointment penetrates the first lyric, then desperation permeates the second one. The rhyme not permitted is illustrative. Babayev seems expressing his hope for amelioration and dissidence, but he does not articulate his thoughts that might go against the custom. And translation for the word in the second line, Salhamistan, is uncertain. I suppose he refers to a crowd of congestion where people stick tight to each other, and in such a collective, its constant members have no right to choose their own directions, even progressive directions. So the second half of this lyric defines the author as an unfaithful slave and a prisoner restricted by the entrenched order. Suspicious of the status quo, Babayev decides to abide by it and warns others against seeking truth. These 2 points disseminate the idea as if study and skills are irrelevant to personal career and social progress. But they also suggest that for the first case, it is mismanagement of human resources to blame. And to put it in another way, knowledge becomes vexing because it is used as a disguise by some corrupted authorities. For the second situation, it is the stubborn collective conscience that the individual intellectual is unable to contend against. Another point, Gulimulad Gulov actually is an elder fellow of Babayev. They graduated from the same university in Tajikistan and they labor in the same economic region in Russia. Gulov once managed a flower store, but last year, when a reporter of Azadi radio station interviewed him, he was a builder. However, the titles of his anthologies, the first one better translated as A Fresh Breath, as well as his image in the newsletter, after all, radiate a flavor of scholarly temperament. And here is a bitterly sarcastic quatrain of Gulov. گفته بودم که خوش خواهم گشت، لایق عیش و نوش خواهم گشت و دو دیپلم من ندانستم عاقبت بودش خواهم گشت. I've claimed that I'd be glad at this vengeance light. With 2 diplomas I didn't expect. Finally I'd get flowers to vend. So the author laughed at himself. He even posted a photo of himself with flowers when he posted this quatrain on the social site at the classmates. And someone replied, making joke on his name, saying that since he's named after flower, he's presumed to sell flowers. Another tried to console him that floristry also requires a good aesthetic taste. It seems that through this merry-making, his misery relieved. It seems that after 3 decades living in Russia, he should have fitted himself into the local society. But still, when he read his verses on motherland for the reporter, his voice gradually got choked. Our representatives have some similarities with other Tajik migrant points, and their characteristics have been pointed out by Kalandalov in light of his conversation with other migrant points. So some instances could be extracted from the works of Gulimulad. Once he saw some beautiful pattern on some clothes, so he recalled the scarves of Muslim women, and finally he referred to Russian girls as examples of losing female modesty. It seems that he would not feel good about those who achieved the success in Tajikistan, but actually he highly praises Sulayan Hakimova, a poetess, professor in Bhutan State University, and journalist. It might be because the latter not only suffered from separation from her migrant parents in the epidemic years, but also asserted in an interview that migrants, in my view, are valiant of the time. All the difficulties faced by the migrant points might have gradually undermined their self-assessment, as the Kalandalov count of the 4 correspondents with whom he conducted a survey in 2021, half of them did not consider themselves as a poetess or point. A graduate from a National University of Tajikistan even refused to give up an interview. Nevertheless, lots of the correspondents of the ethnologist asserted that the favor and acknowledgement from their readers are important for their creative enthusiasm. Our representatives might have been afflicted with the same detrimental self-suspicion. We think that Babayev blamed himself for his desertion, although progress of a country or an academic field is by no means a personal affair. But in assert his right, a philologist is competent to nourish his students with literacy, and according to my experience of cooperation with Tajik students attending Chinese universities in 2020, the ability to spell Tajik words correctly is becoming a rare resource in Tajikistan. So to conclude, the collapse of the former Soviet Union entailed instability and unemployment, which forced the Tajiks to work abroad regardless of their specialties. In this context, the former philologists undertake physical works and vent their feelings in poetry, accepting the failure in the field once he desired. One of them is aware that the dislocation of competence and position, as well as bridging its cost in the teaching staff and scholarly cadre, will finally bring damage to this country. Nevertheless, hypothetically, an upturn is realizable provided that a justice estimating system is established and public opinion change in favor of innovation. Whatever changes take place in Tajikistan, the Tajik points laboring abroad with their works remain a channel for outsiders to know this country and its culture. At least panegyrists of Middle Ages played the role of propagandists. Modern point post their verses on social sites, which transports them even further. For this reason, as I see it, the composition of Tajik points laboring abroad deserves further scrutinization. Thank you for your attention. That's all.
Thank you, Jan, for this very, I think, innovative and fascinating presentation. I think what you presented is another example of the transformations which migrants undergo and how they express their conditions, their life in a foreign land through poetry. And poetry has always been an important means of expression for the Tajiks and Central Asians. So the migration, in some way, it is adding a new kind of themes to the poetry. But at the same time, when you listen and read this poetry, there is a lot of feelings, a lot of despair in some sense of the poetry. But thank you, very, very interesting